And finally, is drinking in the office really all that bad? Can it actually help to bring a team together? I'm joined now by Rory Sutherland, the Spectator's Wikiman columnist. Rory, thank you for joining Spectator TV. Now, in your column for the magazine this week, you have discussed workplace drinking, a topical subject at the moment. Are you for or against?
I suppose I'm not necessarily comfortable with what went on in Downing Street by any means, but I'm not quite comfortable either with the way in which it's reported, as though any consumption of alcohol in the workplace necessarily means that there's a party going on and that it's somehow an egregious activity. And the reason I'd say that in particular is much of this reporting, most of it in fact, is being done by journalists who are hardly completely innocent on the question of workplace drinking themselves. And all I can say is it's complicated. I would like a more forensic investigation of what went on. I would regard music, dancing, that kind of party thing as wholly unacceptable, not necessarily because it's illegal, but because it's in bad faith. On the other hand, I don't regard it as acceptable if you take that photograph of the Downing Street garden taken from an upper window. I don't regard that as having any evidential value whatsoever. It shows some people in a garden. The purpose of the legislation was to prevent people mixing with strangers. Those people were not strangers to each other. They were in a secure space. They'd chosen to go outside, which in terms of epidemiological behaviour was probably a sensible thing to do. And one or two of them were consuming wine. Now, I don't quite think it's fair for that to be used to rile the populace. I accept the fact that 90% of people are rarely, if ever, allowed to drink in the workplace. On the other hand, there are plenty of cultures, including, by the way, medicine, where quite a lot of valuable information transmission takes place by people drinking together after work. In businesses where you're not paid overtime, there's a kind of informal exchange where you stay a little bit late, you do some work, you talk about work, you enjoy a drink. Now, the culture will vary, just as drinking culture varies massively from country to country. I mean, the last 2 or 3 presidents of the United States have been teetotal, for example. Okay? It varies enormously from one workplace to another. Yes, I'm completely open to the argument that political culture is far too boozy. I work in advertising and I think the same thing myself. I think it's obsessively gregarious, dominated by kind of FOMO, and absolutely obsessed with attending endless drinks parties. I don't think that's healthy. At the same time, I don't think it's entirely fair to vilify the behaviour completely. For one thing, people working very, very hard at conditions of some personal risk are entitled to wind down briefly from time to time.
Isn't the explosive issue here that we were not under normal conditions? In fact, the police were being sent after people who were daring to have somebody into their garden, have somebody into their home, even have somebody into their office that wasn't a necessary work event. It isn't the issue that some people in number 10 decided to have some wine at the end of the day. It's that they explicitly made it against the rules for anybody else to do so.
The reason, I mean, this comes down to an interesting thing, which is to what extent you practice deontology and to what extent you practice consequentialism. Okay. Now, the reason parties were banned was not because they allowed for the consumption of alcohol. Nothing about the legislation said anything about what you did in your own home. You could be completely sozzled the entire time under lockdown if conditions allowed. The purpose for banning parties,
probably by yourself if you were living on your own,
was that it led to mixing. Okay. Now, if these people are already mixing, they're in a household. If you had spent a lockdown living alone, undoubtedly those conditions were much, much tougher on you than if you lived in an ashram or a commune. I wouldn't be surprised to hear that, for example, the staff of Windsor Castle or the staff of Buckingham Palace had drinks together during lockdown because they occupied the same space. Okay? The purpose of the law was not to prevent people having as good a time as was feasibly possible under the circumstances. It was to prevent people becoming exposed to additional people other than those to whom they necessarily had to be in contact with. And so I think there's something, we have the rule of law for a reason, and you might argue that the conditions in a workplace, once you have determined that these people have to interact in an office, okay, effectively mean that it isn't relevant to prevent people drinking wine with people with whom they're already communing. Now, I get the fact that it seems unfair, but then so much of this was monstrously unfair.
It's not just that it was a bit unfair or a bit annoying or a bit lonely or a bit sad that people had to basically stay inside and not see other people. I don't remember the guidance coming out from number 10 saying, actually, it's fine if you go out into the park with a bunch of your friends or a bunch of your family and socialize, because we know from a health and safety perspective now that this virus doesn't really transmit outside. In fact, that weekend, they had the police tweeting out, do not break the rules, essentially do not enjoy the good weather with your mates, make sure that you abide by the law. And this isn't an issue of drinking, it's not an issue of having a bit of fun, which I agree, Rory, can be a great time, of course, under the appropriate circumstances. It's the fact that the people who were making these laws have been found to have been breaking them. And they didn't update the laws for everybody else, so it wasn't as if people could enjoy these good times as well.
Well, other people couldn't enjoy the fact if it involved meeting other people, although on the very same day the beaches were fairly crowded, let's be honest, okay? It wasn't as if the public were being entirely obedient out of doors. I've already written a piece in The Spectator which explained why garden parties had to be banned even when it was known that outdoor transmission was comparatively rare, which is the simple fact that an outdoor garden party turns into an indoor party. That's what tends to happen towards the end of the evening when it gets cold, when people need to leave the loo. In this case, if these people were not meeting anybody new, if they'd invited people from adjacent buildings, absolutely clear. That's an absolutely clear breach of the rules. Here, it's a little more ambiguous. The second question to ask is not necessarily about whether it's good or bad, but whether this deserves the volume of media attention that it's getting. And it strikes me to some extent that we don't actually need the metaverse because the media already creates it for us. A kind of parallel reality where attention is paid to things to the extent to which it suits a preordained narrative. And I don't think the record, by the way, of journalism here is all that great. Robert Cialdini does a lot of work which shows that most media bias is not the result of a biased depiction of opinions. It's the relative prominence that is given to different stories. That's the greater vehicle of media bias, okay? Now, you can imagine a world in which a Blair regime or another regime to whom journalists were better disposed had committed the same infractions, where this would have received much less attention and would have ended up on page 5. Okay? I don't think this is an area which necessarily should be dominating the news cycle when you have, a potential invasion of Ukraine on the cards. Okay? And there's something about the incessant attention given to the story which doesn't seem to me entirely in proportion to the infractions committed.
Well, Rory, after that discussion, I think you've earned yourself a drink. Thanks for joining Spectator TV. And that's it for this week. If you've enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe to the Spectator's YouTube channel. Just click the subscribe button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon to make sure you never miss an episode. Thanks for watching, and do join us again next week.